In October of 2024, Game Freak, the company that creates the Pokemon games, suffered a massive public data leak. A wealth of lore, designs, and unused content suddenly flooded the internet. Besides the dark legal implications of the leak, which likely had corporate lawyers scrambling, the mood of this unfurling event was mostly curiosity. Online fans had their fun digging through all the abandoned Pokemon designs and concepts, which inspired some to make fan art and others to excitedly speculate on what past games could have been. However, there was also some other content that floated to the surface, catching the eye of the looters. Among the leaks, there was lore.
This is what we're breaching into. Okay, let's no bones about it. We're getting explosion here. Okay, bestiality rape fanfiction between Pokemon and humans.
Let's just say that they lived up to the freaks in Game Freak.
The stories elicited strong reactions from the public for good reason. These stories detailed interspecies marriage and impregnation, as well as curses, mutilation, and death. One involves a young woman who tortures and mutilates Slackoth and is punished with a cursed pregnancy and birth of a Slackoth baby. Another involves a hunter who comes upon a Rapidash, which he spares and makes his wife. And the most infamous of these stories, a wild Typhlosion, disguised as a man, marries a girl who wanders lost in the woods. And after years of marriage and the subsequent birth of a child, the girl's father finds her and slays her Typhlosion husband. Of course, all this resulted in a deluge of memes and jokes, but I also heard inaccurate descriptions passed around, that these stories were porn, or even more strikingly, furry porn, bestiality, zoophilia. Now, I've been around the internet a long time. I have come across many items that I would call fetishistic or pornographic. I know what certain Pokemon fans are up to, but these stories are not porn, and anyone who reads them in the hopes of finding some is going to be sorely disappointed.
Let's start the stream off right with bestiality pornography. One day when she was awoke, the girl was holding a child. What? Where did that come from?
Perhaps it's genre blindness, because people were so focused on the disturbing plots that they didn't recognize these stories for how they were obviously constructed. These are myths, fairy tales. Even if your only exposure to fairy tales is that of the Brothers Grimm variety, you ought to know that there are often disturbing and reality-bending details sprinkled throughout. Transformations, curses, talking animals, cannibalism, death. These kinds of myths are not even unprecedented in the Pokemon lore. In the 4th generation of games, Pearl and Diamond, a library contains books that tell of ancient myths. One telling of a warrior who used a sword to slay every Pokemon he encountered. Another peddling a folktale about eating fish Pokemon down to their bones, and throwing them back into the water to regenerate their bodies. But the most relevant folktales are as follows. There lived a Pokemon in the forest. In the forest, the Pokemon shed its hide to sleep as a human. Awakened, the human dons the Pokemon hide to roam villages. And there were once Pokemon that became very close to humans. There once were humans and Pokemon that ate together at the same table. It was a time when there existed no differences to distinguish the two. So we have the motif of creatures removing their hide to transform into humans, even living among humans in disguise. And we have a reference to Pokemon and humans having no differences at one point in prehistory. This is alluded to in the text of the leaked lore. Importantly, that second story was translated into English to obscure a more explicit meaning in the original Japanese text. In Japanese, it states that humans and Pokemon used to marry. You would be well excused for not knowing this pre-established lore. You would also be justified in finding all this very strange, maybe even alien to your sensibilities. The idea of a person marrying, essentially, an animal is odd, even when we acknowledge that these are fanciful folklore. But when I heard about these stories and read them, not only did I recognize these elements as prior lore in the Pokemon world, because I'm a nerd, but 2 other things also came to mind: Psyche and Selkies. If you don't know the story of Cupid and Psyche, know that the narrative is pulled from a Roman novel and goes something like this. Psyche is a beautiful human girl who is condemned to death, and the god Cupid, who falls in love with her and pities her, arranges for her to be spirited away and into his divine mansion. There, Cupid speaks to Psyche through a disembodied voice, which welcomes her inside and eventually guides her to the bedroom. In the total darkness, she and Cupid become intimate, and the rule is established that she must never look upon him. Time goes on, the nightly visits continue. She becomes pregnant. Then her jealous sisters come to visit. They persuade her that since she doesn't know what he looks like, he could well be a horrible monster. So she decides to break the promise and sneak into the bedroom with a lantern in one hand and a knife in the other. She finds Cupid asleep, and he's devastatingly handsome. But it's too late, and the trust has been broken, so Cupid flees, leaving Psyche alone. Don't worry though, the story doesn't end there. The relationship culminates in a wedding, but for now, keep these story beats in mind. On the other side are Selkies. Selkies are an Irish folktale I first encountered in my childhood with the film The Secret of Roan Inish. The idea goes that Selkies are seals who can remove their sealskin and reveal underneath beautiful maidens. If you are a sailor who is sneaky enough, you can steal this sealskin and thus entrap the woman to be your wife. Many iterations of the story go on to say she proves to be a loving wife and doting mother, until one day, one of her young children innocently asks her why their father keeps a sealskin locked up in that chest in the attic. The wife swiftly finds the secret, steals back her skin, and returns to the sea as a seal once more, leaving behind her husband and family. Psyche and Selkies were both prominent stories in my brain when I read The Typhlosion Leak, so a number of narrative elements stuck out to me. We have the young maiden left in the wilderness at risk of death, rescued by a mysterious figure. We have a promise not to look the mysterious lover in the face. We have a faux marriage that results in a pregnancy, and a realization of the husband's true identity. We have the significance of the pelt, the sealskin, being placed on the wife and child, resulting in a transformation into beasts. You might dismiss these similarities as mere coincidence. Surely the employee writing proposed Pokemon mythology wasn't directly referencing these texts. But it turns out they didn't have to, because Japan has its own stories of animal wives. The Typhlosion story itself is probably a reference to the Japanese mythological shape-shifting badger, the Mujina, but the most famous folktales referencing animal marriage are that of the crane wife and the fox wife. So Japan has this story too. But it doesn't stop there. The English folktale of the Black Bull of Norway, the Scandinavian stories of the Swan Maiden and the Bear Husband, the Scottish myth of the Crow's Wife, the Serbian Serpent Bridegroom, a Russian tale of a woman marrying a lake beetle, the Monkey Wife of the Philippines. It is hard to overstate how prevalent these animal marriage folktales are throughout the world. It's almost a cultural universal, and it's been the subject of study in the field of folkloristics, where these are called animal as bridegroom and animal bride stories. And let me tell you, once you sit down to read these different tales from sometimes entirely disparate cultures, the similarities are shocking. There's the bedroom transformation. There's the secret animal-human transformation. There's the shedding of the skin. There's the revelation of identity, which leads to a crisis. These patterns are so compelling that, to date, folklorists hotly debate if the similarities are due to cross-cultural communication at some very ancient point in history. And it would have had to be ancient because these stories are old. It might feel more understandable to think that these stories all started in one place and spread accordingly. But if you think through the timescale and spacing, the theory feels more and more implausible. How can a story, which is by its very nature mutable and bendable, retain its core elements so closely after being spread in largely oral-only contexts for thousands of years, across continents and language barriers? A much more interesting theory is that these shared stories are not the result of sharing at all, but are each spontaneously created within their cultural spheres, following patterns based on universally recognized symbols. How and why these stories spring up becomes a psychological sort of question. If this is a recurring human idea, then what does it mean? Marriage is a frightening thing. In the modern world, marriage is an independent, optional, and unenchanted legal act, But for most times and places, marriages were arranged, pressured, or at least vetted by a larger community with a lot at stake. Attaining a spouse was a great source of anxiety and uncertainty, intertwined with tensions about tribal and familial connections, money, resources, lineage, and of course, sexual desire. The various folktales about marrying animals used animals as symbolic vehicles in exploring these anxieties. So these are not stories about bestiality or zoophilia. These are stories about humanity. Every story of an animal's savagery, predation, ugliness, desire, terror, or transformation is all commentary on the eternal dance between man and woman. Two creatures that, as far as these ancient stories are concerned, are entirely different species. This, I have to emphasize, is not my novel interpretation. Folklorists have been explaining the animal marriage stories in this way for as long as they've been writing them down. What's interesting to me, at least, is how animal as bride and animal as bridegroom stories differ. Animals as grooms are more formulaic. The young woman is promised in marriage to a beast of some kind, often because her family owes something to the beast. The groom is some sort of grotesque, monstrous, predatory creature, something that would, in another context, be consuming the young girl. A bear, a snake, a boar, a raven. A few stories feature animal grooms that are more pitiable than frightening, like the famous frog prince, or the lake beetle husband of Russian folklore. These are still loathsome choices for the young woman, of course, though less physically threatening. The woman initially rejects her groom in these stories, but is won over when the man reveals that his form is temporary, the result of some curse, a spell that can be broken with her love. If she betrays him, he runs off, and she has to pursue him in some kind of redemptive quest. Recurring themes for the animal as bridegroom are predation, the fear of being eaten, the arranged marriage, the bedroom transformation, the initial rejection, a breaking of trust. Some of these stories feature jealous or distrustful family members who try to sabotage the marriage. It's not hard to see what these stories are telling young girls. When you are inevitably arranged to be married, likely to a stranger, it's an intimidating event. He's going to seem to be a predator, looking to devour you, or perhaps, in an equally bad arrangement, he's going to seem as disgusting and unappetizing as a toad. Your jealous sisters might whisper lies to you, but really you should stick it out. That hulking, terrifying exterior is merely a skin, and the man underneath is worthy of your love. Maybe all it will take is some feminine care and devotion to make it shine through. In animal bride stories, the groom typically plays a more active role. Rather than being betrothed to an animal, he might be a hunter or a prince who selects an animal as his bride due to some accidental circumstance. His brothers or male companions make fun of his choice, but he nobly keeps his promise. The animal bride then proves her worth somehow, maybe with cooking or housekeeping or weaving, and by the end of the story, she transforms into a beautiful human woman, becoming a proper partner for her husband. A man in such cultures will feel anxious about choosing his wife. What if she isn't beautiful? What if his peers mock his selection? These kinds of stories assuage his worries. If she isn't beautiful by her exterior, you can make her beautiful by your loyalty and favor. Alternatively, there are stories of men being tricked or surprised by animal brides. The Japanese stories of the crane, fox, and clam wife are all nearly the same. The hunter comes across an animal, has pity on it and spares it, and several days later, a beautiful woman appears at his doorstep, offering to be his wife. They have a happy homestead for a time, but she makes him promise never to look upon her as she cooks. It's when the man breaks his promise that he sees his wife's true form, and the animal wife runs away. Yet another common trope for the animal bride is the shedding of the animal skin, and the man who seizes the skin when the woman isn't paying attention. After grabbing it, he may burn it or lock it away, thereby entrapping the maiden for marriage. Sometimes men are straightforwardly awarded for this assertiveness. They get the girl, and it's a happy ending. In the case of the Selkies, it's a more muddled message. The woman finds her skin again and transforms back into a seal, leaving her family behind. Perhaps this is a warning about the fickleness of a foreign wife, or a more broad condemnation of taking a wife by coercion and trickery. Whatever the case is, the fear that your dissatisfied, homesick wife might up and leave you is probably at the root of the tale. Now, given that these are near universally retold tropes across different times and cultures, we should consider how these animal marriage stories carry into the modern day, especially given one important wrinkle. By today's standards, we find these stories weird. When I describe animal marriage folklore to the average American child, even at the age for which these stories were originally intended, I get uncomfortable giggles, expressions of revulsion and disbelief. Judeo-Christian religions don't harbor fairy tales of foxes turning into women and marrying men. Any animal marriage stories surviving Christendom come from pagan European nations, passing them down. And as we get further and further away from our ethnic forebears, the more these tales seem alien. This, to my mind, has left us with a twofold gap of understanding. First, many of us do not know the meaning of these stories. And two, we no longer recognize the recurring universal themes when they bubble back up to the surface in modern narratives, causing considerable confusion and panic. If you are an internet resident, you know what furries are. In fact, you may know some personally. Furries as a category have existed for decades now, so it's been interesting to watch furries enter mainstream public consciousness through a series of bizarre and unfortunate circumstances. Some of this has been due to a moral panic, tangentially related to trans issues in schools. This convergence of identity and bathroom anxiety led to multiple people in different places repeating the claim that school districts allowed litter boxes, animal noises, and animal identification as valid protected expressions. The litter box controversy I dismiss out of hand. This is not and has never been a practice in the furry community. In terms of scatological, diapers are a more common theme in the subculture. To what extent confused teachers and administrators are treating animal roleplay as valid quote-unquote trans identities, I honestly don't know. But I suspect even that is being exaggerated or misunderstood. This kerfuffle, I think, comes down to the fact that boomers who watch Fox News are encountering the subculture for the first time, and conflating numerous concepts into it. Not a surprise. If you're following my thesis so far, you know humans have engaged in animal symbolism in a variety of ways that can be spuriously mislabeled. Let us be clear then what furries are. Furry is a subculture oriented around the interest in cartoon, anthropomorphic animals. This usually involves the consumption and creation of artwork, drawings, paintings, renders, and for the more financially invested, fursuits, allowing for the individual to roleplay as said anthropomorphic cartoon animal. Roleplay, including written and in-person, is a frequent part of it. That is the baseline. The variety and nuances within the fandom is where things get hairy. You may think furries identify as animals, but this is largely not true. Furries, for the most part, admit what they are doing is pure pretend and roleplay, driven by a special interest in a certain aesthetic style, not species orientation. The idea of identifying as animals exists. It's usually called otherkin or therian. It's kind of its own thing, even though there's some crossover.
On all levels except physical, I am a wolf.
You may also think that furries are sexually attracted to animals. Here again, I think we must be precise. Furries engage in plenty of sexual roleplay, and I would go so far as to identify the fandom as a whole as innately sexual. Zoophiles exist in the fandom and have been unduly tolerated at times, but it is unjustified to paint the entire fandom as interested in sex with actual animals. The most common degeneracy among them is promiscuity. Furry conventions are notorious hookup spots. They may have sex in costume, but they're still having sex exclusively with humans. The sexual interest is in human personhood, augmented with these animal characteristics. Human-shaped frames, draped in fur and fangs, tails and paws. A flesh and blood animal cannot accomplish this sexual fantasy. Furries are not the only people who experience sexual desire by adding animal characteristics to their play. We have anime catgirls, we have the Playboy bunny, we have vampires, we have werewolves. Further back in human history, we have a whole menagerie of animal features blending into the realm of erotic. You can hastily claim that adding animal traits into the mix makes the situation dubiously zoophilic, but I think there is something much more interesting at play. First, we should understand the interest in animal features as totemic in nature. Fangs, claws, and fur are not the innately sexual aspect. A better answer might be reached by asking why certain animals' body parts receive this focus. All human cultures ascribe symbolic significance to different animals. Some for religious reasons, some for metaphorical reasons. But in the West, where furries mostly developed as a subculture, most of them experienced animals first as childhood pets. While the cat dominates memes on the internet, it is the canine that dominates Western culture as a totem. We grew up with dogs, and dogs represent deep feelings of comfort, safety, and connection, especially for furries who likely grew up awkward and lonely. Fluffy tails, soft muzzles, wet noses. A fixation on these may not be a sign of sexuality toward the animals themselves, but a common paraphilic pathway by which innocuous and comforting stimuli gets packaged with other, stronger stimuli and is transformed into a hybridized, distinct sexual desire that can only be explored in the realm of fantasy. In other words, it's really about feelings and cultural associations. Second, we should read this roleplay in the context of the much longer history of animal roleplay and how different animals signify sexual roles as well. Notice that in animal marriage stories, the species of animal is not neutrally chosen. For animal wives, the creatures are almost always docile, vulnerable, diminutive, powerless, or other common targets for hunting within that culture. Buffalo, rabbit, monkey, mouse, crane, fox. For animal husbands, they are nearly always powerful, dangerous, predatory, or vile. The snake, bull, bear, crow, frog. Today, we still intuitively map animal species on a gendered spectrum. Consider how children begin to roleplay at a young age, and how girls tend to mew like kittens, hop like bunnies, or squeak like mice, while boys prefer to roar, growl, and bite, mimicking wolves and bears and lions. We know the hunter-hunted dynamic, and it is simulated in the earliest sexual roleplay, that is, when boys and girls first begin to play out their roles as two distinct sexes. Because we don't understand animal symbolism as totemic and sexual roleplay, we end up calling things furry when they aren't. When a middle school girl becomes fixated on wearing cat ear headbands and meowing, that's not furry. That is her exploration of the cultural associations of catness, comfort, warmth, playfulness, and developing her understanding of sexed life. Female as cute, diminutive, physically welcoming. When we're too literal and prone to moral panic, we're undercutting very normal and very old forms of imaginative play. The fear of children being furries isn't the only place we see this panic. In adult literature, especially adult dark romance, there have been a number of controversies, some of which have gotten attention as of late. Raunchy books about vampires, werewolves, and rapacious hunks have been around for a long time. But with the rise of self-publishing, it's easier than ever for amateur authors to push out pornographic novels about monster men ravishing young women in increasingly lurid detail. Some of the concerns voiced by critics of the genre I understand and agree with. It probably isn't good for women's brains that they are reading sexually sensational content for hours a day, using these novels as escape from the much more important task of meeting men in real life and forming families. But where I depart from the critics is here. This is not a new concept, really. It is simply more visible. The elaborate dance of wooing and taming a monster man is ancient. The animal husband stories I've described to you should tell you this. The sexuality was always present, just not as graphic. What I read into the emergence of monster romance is this. Sexual fears and desires are a human constant, and no matter how we try to flatten them in the name of equality between the sexes, the difference in male and female desire will spill out sideways. Women are both terrified and compelled by the monster. The male is strong, threatening, and could snap her in two, but he is also bonded to her, protective, sensitive to her needs. This isn't bestiality or a sign of severe sexual disorder. This is ancient sexual myth. What's ironic here is that progressives who publish and read this content are so deeply in denial that they plaster the term queer over the genre. They insist it's transgressive and feminist and liberating.
She was a good feminist, she told herself.
When at the root of it, It is probably the single most regressively coded literature being mass consumed at the moment.
Yeah, I'm a queer writer, and it's just like, lady with fucking dude. It's just lady with dude. This one is just also just lady with dude. Queer writing. Does she even have it? Lady with Satan, dude.
Women who were raised to believe that men and women are really the same and should exist in gender-neutral, egalitarian relationships are simultaneously ravenously reading books, reliving the traditional roles of domination and submission, of predator and prey. Except this time, it's dressed up in a progressive language to make it sound perverse. It's culturally suspect for a woman to say she wants a traditional husband who is the head of the household, a man she is willing to submit to. But this suspicion can be brushed away if the same dynamic is presented as sexual kink. And this is really the problem with today's kink culture. It is cultural appropriation of ancient traditional values. It takes the profound, meaningful, and intimate sexual dynamics of the sexes and reduces them to a costume. This is to be expected at some level. The cultural expectation today is that the sexual act is a flat, contractual exchange between the two or more liberal agents, whose gender is unimportant. But what has been discovered by people living out this narrative is it is depressing, unsatisfying, and deeply unsexy. So they take up kink. They plunder the symbols and archetypes of the archaic, ape its aesthetics, and still give lip service to the modern theology of the liberal consenting agent. I don't want to overstate my condemnation here. It is not so much about the practice of the kink itself, but how kink culture has created a sort of plausible deniability. The issue is its shallowness, its theatricality. Keeping this dynamic in the realm of fetish and roleplay is just another way to hide one's face from reality. The lesson of the fairy tale isn't that you should put on armor and fight a dragon, nor is it that you should pretend on your weekends at the Renaissance fair. The truths of the story will emerge from your life organically. Thus, it would be a poor conclusion from animal marriage tales to say that we should compensate by investing in a good roleplay routine. Sexual dynamics between men and women are meant to be lived, not contrived. Here then is my culminating thesis. Animal marriage stories present a healthy understanding and exploration of human sexuality. Animal marriage stories give us a clear view of the differences in sexual fears and desires between men and women. It makes the distinction of male and female and addresses them in accessible ways. The tropes of animal marriage stories are so universal and powerful that they re-emerge even in an overly literal culture like our own. The troubles we run into involve a disconnect, that we don't practice sexual metaphor the way our ancestors did, nor do we like the idea that males and females have significant differences. Metaphor gets read as paraphilia, and roles get read as oppression. Even when males and females try to twist and wind their way back to these ancient patterns, they do so in contradictory and inverted ways. This has contributed to an increasing misunderstanding and conflict between the sexes, as they continue to misread or wrongfully signal their desires to one another. This miscommunication is now being impressed upon our children. Not that long ago, tales like Beauty and the Beast were understood properly as fairy tales. Now, the modern audience, composed of ideologically invested and narratively literalistic adults, has been deconstructed into a tale of domination and abuse. A proper conservative reading of the story is that its mythological structure, its animal husband archetypes, speaks to the universal anxieties and triumphs of human sexual union. Now, similar stories would be maligned as furry, and the modern adaptation scrambles to justify and sanitize its problematic elements of male dominance and female taming and sacrifice. Both criticisms fall flat against the original demonstrable purpose. The proper takeaway, then, is that we must curb our instinct toward moral panic. It's easy to see things that are weird, unsettling, or unfamiliar, and rush to label it. It's harder to pause and try to understand it, to contextualize it, to think back to the recent and ancient past, and notice that truly nothing is new under the sun. Condemn what is condemnable, for sure, but exhibit some epistemic humility here. Both conservatives and progressives seem to be psychologically locked into their respective historical fetishes. True tradition is the 1950s, and true revolution was the 70s. But history and human nature is so much more ancient, complicated, and strange. The ways we invent and reiterate symbols should inspire and fascinate.